It's December 2010. We're in a ballroom in Russia. It's a glitzy night. Hundreds of guests in black tie, sitting at tables piled with flowers and champagne. A ripple moves through the room. A man in a tuxedo and open white shirt steps onto the stage and stands at the microphone. Vladimir Putin. 10 years since he became president, he's now one of the most powerful men on earth. The room falls silent. And then it begins.
I found my thrill on blueberry.
That's right. Putin, the ex-KGB hardman, is singing. Not a patriotic Russian anthem, but Blueberry Hill, a 1950s American classic.
The moon stood still.
As he croons away, like a man auditioning for a late-night talent show, the camera pans across the audience. It's a charity gala packed with star power. Goldie Hawn and Monica Bellucci are clicking their fingers to the beat. Kevin Costner rises to his feet, swept up in a standing ovation. All eyes are locked on Putin as he sings. He's a little off-key, perhaps, but he's completely sure of himself. And this, right here, is the version of Putin the world sees in 2010. The showman, the statesman, the charmer who serenades Hollywood stars and walks into Western summits where no one asks uncomfortable questions. Questions about his critics who end up jailed or dead. Or about the apartment bombings and the doubts that lingered. For years, the world, by and large, looked away, and Vladimir Putin stayed centre stage, performing a carefully choreographed version of himself, while another story remained buried in the shadows. From the BBC, I'm Helena Merriman, and this is Putin and the Apartment Bombs. Episode 7, Hindsight. Over the last 6 episodes, we've taken you deep into the story of the apartment bombs, the explosions, the investigations, and the unsettling questions. For months now, we've been talking to the journalists who first covered this story, the reporters who were there, on the ground, in the smoke, the chaos and confusion. And now, with over 25 years of distance, we're asking them a simple question. Who did they think bombed those 4 apartment buildings? Was it the Chechen militants the government blamed? Or was it an FSB plot to create a climate of fear so that one of their own, Vladimir Putin, could step in as the hard man the country needed and become president? Or is that nothing more than a wild conspiracy theory? Who do you think was responsible for the apartment bombings?
Well, now the bombings were the work of professionals.
Here's journalist David Satter. We met him in episode 2. He's written about Russia for over 4 decades, and he was the first Western journalist to write an article suggesting that the FSB were involved. Since then, he's never been able to let this story go. Spent years trying to get to the bottom of it.
Terrorists can go with guns and shoot up a shopping center. But to blow up a building, you have to be a specialist. You have to have the right mix of explosives. You have to place the bomb next to the proper structural element in the building. And the people with that kind of expert knowledge are only in the FSB.
So that's David's first argument. Then he says, look at Ryazan, the city where police found a 5th bomb in the basement of an apartment building, and where the 2 suspected bombers turned out to be FSB agents.
When FSB agents were caught putting a bomb in a building in Ryazan, it was clear what was going on.
Remember, the FSB said this wasn't a bomb, just sacks of sugar, all part of a training exercise to test public vigilance. We've been staring at this story for months, And this is one of the hardest bits to make sense of. That in the middle of a wave of real bomb attacks across Russia, attacks that killed hundreds, that drove people to sleep outside in fear, that the government would choose this moment to plant fake bombs of its own. Is there any world where that could make sense to do a training exercise?
No, for one thing, if it's a training exercise, why involving the civilian population, why were not the local authorities informed? Which is obligatory under the law.
And from everything we've read, it seems pretty clear that the local FSB in Ryazan had no idea that they were taking part in a training exercise. But the FSB leadership in Moscow has never changed their story. They've always maintained that Ryazan was just a drill. There's another moment that David Satter highlights.
The bombing in Volgodonsk had one peculiarity, and that was that it was announced in advance.
He's referring to that bizarre scene in the Russian parliament when the speaker said that an apartment in a town called Volgodonsk had been bombed 3 days before it was bombed.
You say the building's been blown up on the 13th and it's blown up on the 16th. What's going on in this country?
It's a conundrum, he says, that leaves you with two possible explanations.
It was just an unbelievable coincidence that the mistake became a reality 3 days later. Or somehow the plan to blow up the building in Volgodonsk was known in advance.
For David Satter, there's only one conclusion.
This was carried out by the FSB.
And for David, that then raises the question, what about Vladimir Putin? Because just weeks before those apartments exploded, Putin was running the FSB.
Putin was definitely part of it, because Putin was the head of the FSB.
It's a big claim, one Putin has always denied. In his authorized biography, published in April 2000, 6 months after the bombs, Putin says, "What? Blowing up our own apartment buildings? You know, that is really utter nonsense. It's totally insane. No one in the Russian special services would be capable of such a crime against his own people."
I think it's important to look at how people climb to power.
Here's Scott Anderson, veteran war correspondent who now writes for the New York Times magazine. He spent weeks with former FSB agent turned whistleblower Mikhail Trepashkin.
I compare it to the Reichstag fire that Hitler used to assume dictatorial powers. In both cases, this mysterious bombing of the Reichstag on one hand, the apartment bombs in Russia on the other, both men used that to propel themselves to even greater power. I mean, I can't go into a court of law and prove that Vladimir Putin ordered the apartment bombings. I do know, though, that if those bombings had been carried out by the FSB, it was on direct orders of Vladimir Putin, because that's the way that organization works. It would not have been freelancing by underlings.
For Scott, the fact that Putin benefited from the bombs establishes a motive. The attacks gave Putin the pretext for a full-scale war in Chechnya, he says, where Putin cast himself as the tough leader Russia had been waiting for. Putin's approval ratings for the presidency, once 2%, then shot through the roof, and he became president just 6 months later.
From the first moment I knew about house bombings, I was sure that it's a foul play. The government is behind it.
Here's Yevgeny Kiselyov, former Director General of NTV, the network that put FSB officers and Ryazan residents face to face for that extraordinary TV show.
I would, so to say, eat my hat if it turns out that they were not involved. I am convinced that people with high connections in the government, in the security services, were involved.
Like David Satter and Scott Anderson, Yevgeny Kiselyov points to the strange events of Ryazan and Volgodonsk. And he adds something else.
There were a number of strange deaths and assassinations that to this day convince the people that a lot of foul play was involved in the whole story of apartment bombings.
Remember, one of the men on the independent commission investigating the bombs was shot dead outside his house. The other died a slow, agonising death, which journalists at the time suspected was poisoning. Then there was Alexander Litvinenko, the FSB whistleblower poisoned on the streets of London. And that's not all, Yevgeny says. Just look at how Putin's behaved in the years since, how he wields power on the world stage. The annexation of Crimea in 2014, the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. For Yevgeny, this is all part of a pattern of behaviour.
Now, when we are looking at what Putin and his generals are doing in Ukraine, every sane person understands that they were capable of doing that 26 years ago because they don't care about people's lives.
So David Satter, Scott Anderson and Yevgeny Kiselyov all think that the evidence points to an FSB plot. But for other journalists looking at this, the story takes them somewhere else. Do you think this idea that the FSB orchestrated the attacks, would you say that's a conspiracy theory?
I would say that's a conspiracy theory. I don't think we can prove that.
Here's Stephen Lee Myers. He covered the trial of the apartment bombs when he was Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times and interviewed Putin a few years after he became president.
I've read the evidence, believe me, and there have been long inquiries done into it of journalists I respect who have come to a different conclusion.
First, he says, start with motive.
People say Putin needed a war to rise to power. That's the logic of it, right? This would somehow propel this unknown guy into leadership.
But Stephen doesn't buy it.
The logic doesn't work for me in the case of the Chechen war.
He points out that there'd been fighting between Chechen militants and Russian soldiers weeks before the apartment bombs. This was in the Republic of Dagestan, just next to Chechnya.
A large force of Chechen fighters launches this invasion into Dagestan to expand the Islamic State. And Putin, as prime minister, sent in troops and drove them out. So the war with Chechnya had already started again. And Russian people, not necessarily everyone in the political elite, were very happy to see the Russians go in there and beat the hell out of them.
As Stephen sees it, Putin didn't need to bomb 4 apartments to justify a new war against Chechnya. In his view, that war had already begun. Which is why for Stephen, the motive for Chechen militants looks more straightforward. He points to what was happening in 1999, in the months before the bombs. The Kremlin's grip on Chechnya was slipping, and Boris Yeltsin's government was unraveling.
So he was ill, and the country was ill. And I think that the Chechens, and I'm speculating now, saw that this was a moment of weakness in the Russian state, and that this was going to be their best chance where they could solidify their control, not only of the Republic of Chechnya, but a broader Islamic state. You have to get in the mind of a terrorist, and I don't think they think like you and I do. I think they're like, we're going to strike the enemy and weaken it while it's down, and they don't think about the consequences. And I think that it wasn't beyond them to carry out these kinds of terrorist attacks.
Just look at the attacks they've carried out in Russia over the years, he says. There was that siege in the Moscow theatre in 2002, the one where Chechen gunmen took more than 900 people hostage. 2 years later, in 2004, 2 passenger planes were attacked by Islamist militants who linked themselves to the Chechen cause.
2 airplanes flying across Russia blew up in midair. And everybody forgets that. Each one of those killed 100 and some people, as I recall.
And the explosives found in the plane wreckage? According to the FSB, it was hexagon. The same explosive used in at least one of the apartment bombs. So the idea we've heard in this series, that Chechen militants couldn't possibly get hold of hexagon, well, either they could, or we're going to need a second season to investigate those aircraft bombings. And the same year, 2004, a Chechen suicide bomber struck the Moscow metro during rush hour, killing over 40 people. And then
They seized a school of kids and their parents in Beslan, and that also ended in a massacre with hundreds of kids dying. I mean, it was heartbreaking.
So for Stephen Lee Myers, Chechen militants not only had a plausible motive for the apartment bombings, it also fits their record of violent attacks inside Russia. Who do you think blew up those apartments?
I believe that some people involved in the Islamic extremist cause related to or adjacent to the war in Chechnya were definitely involved.
So where does this leave us? There are competing arguments that point in very different directions. One leads to the FSB, the other to militants from Chechnya or elsewhere in the region. But for some of the reporters we spoke to, the picture is still so murky that it's too hard to make a call either way. What's your take on it now? Who do you think plotted the bombs?
I'm not sure I'd give an answer. I think it's plausible that it was the FSB, but that's different from saying it was, and that there's proof about it.
Here's former BBC security correspondent Gordon Correra.
There are so many odd elements to what happened. I mean, it did seem almost too much, given the death toll from those bombings, that it was the FSB. I think that was the view then. But the more you look at it, the more you kind of wonder. So I don't think I would give a definitive answer. But plausible, yes. And I think at the time, early 2000s, there was more scepticism of it. And I think that scepticism has faded over the years, because I think the more you learn about Putin and about the Russian security services and what they're capable of, the more you go, maybe it isn't as quite as outlandish a claim as people thought. Is there proof? I've not seen definitive proof, but I think there's less scepticism now than there was then.
It's now been over 25 years since the bombings. When you look back on them now, what do you make of them? How do you think about them?
I just think of Ryazan.
That's Andrew Harding, the BBC's correspondent in Moscow when those 4 apartment buildings were bombed. And he's still puzzling over what happened in Ryazan, that 5th bomb which the FSB said was part of a drill. Which is confusing because, at first, the local FSB said it was real.
They were the ones who did the tests. They were the ones who said, this ain't sugar. This is a genuine thing.
So Andrew says he understands why some people see what happened in Ryazan as evidence of FSB involvement.
On the one hand, it just made absolute sense. On the other hand, it just felt too awful to believe.
But just as he has no clear answers about the FSB, he's also torn about the role Chechen militants might have played. And he's in a good position to know. In fact, of all the journalists we've spoken to for this series, Andrew Harding has spent the most time with Chechen militants, including with their notorious commander, Shamil Basayev.
He was perhaps the most intrepid, the most aggressive rebel fighter.
Do you think he was the kind of person that could have been behind something like this?
Yeah. I mean, he's shown no qualms about taking civilian hostages. I think civilian hostages were more a means to an end. So in that way, I don't think the apartment bombings up in Moscow were a very likely type of Chechen project. But this was a man with a track record of killing Russian civilians. There was a baked-in sense of contempt for Russia. He felt Russia was rotten, that Russia needed more than just to be pushed out of Chechnya, that this was an evil empire. And so I can see that if an opportunity presented itself to cause agony in Moscow, that he could have taken that opportunity. I have no evidence for that, but I don't see it as impossible at all.
So for Andrew Harding, 25 years on, the picture still isn't clear. But perhaps there's another way to look at this story. So far, we've been asking whether the FSB or Chechen militants were responsible. What if that's the wrong question? What if we're guilty of doing something journalists often do, looking for a neat story with a single mastermind pulling all the strings? What if it wasn't the FSB or the Chechens? What if it was both?
What's always puzzled me was the one bomb that didn't go off, Rizan. And this is really what gave birth to the conspiracy theories.
Here's the New York Times' Stephen Lee Myers again, the journalist who doesn't buy the idea that Putin and the FSB orchestrated the whole thing.
I've puzzled over this, and I did a lot of reporting to try to resolve this original sin of the Putin years. And I came away with the conclusion that there were certainly FSB people involved. Corruption in the FSB and the law enforcement generally in Russia at the time was extraordinary. You can't underestimate it. So it would not surprise me to know that somebody from the FSB working with people who are known terrorists would take money to do something like this. Cold-bloodedly, blowing up an apartment building full of civilians. That's not to say that the FSB orchestrated it. So I haven't seen evidence of a government conspiracy that has persuaded me that the government was behind this. But I know that there are people who believe that. And I think that the truth is probably somewhere in between.
Corruption, as Stephen says, was rampant in the FSB. So one possibility is that individual FSB officers were involved in the bombs without being part of a grand FSB plot. This could explain some of the strange things that went on after Rizan. Perhaps the FSB wasn't protecting people at the top, but covering up for a few corrupt officers further down.
It's possible that we don't know what happened because they didn't want to expose the complicity of corrupt people who, took a bribe and looked the other way. And, they're kind of protecting their own and the reputation of the security services over the truth.
Plus, he says, it might also explain the secrecy surrounding the government's investigation into the bombs.
Looking back now, you see that this is a government that hides its secrets. And I believe that's deliberate. I believe that there was something they had to hide. You didn't have the transparency you would expect or would hope to have that would put to rest the answers of what really happened. An open trial of the evidence that linked these bombings to certain people might have convinced people, but we didn't ever have that.
Did you say that's because you think there was something they were trying to hide?
Absolutely, there's something that they haven't told us about this. And a lot of what we should know has been classified or buried or covered up. And we see this over and over and over again in Russia. Events that would demand a public inquiry in democratic societies are simply covered up. And it's not always because there's necessarily some nefarious government conspiracy behind them. It's just they don't have that tradition of leveling with their own people. They cover things up.
That's the interesting point, isn't it? That some people would see that as perhaps a strong indication of a conspiracy theory.
Yeah. And that's the tension that I've always felt around this particular question. It's part of the origin story of Vladimir Putin. It's intertwined with his arrival on the scene as the future leader. And I think until you can persuade enough people that you know what really did happen, you're always going to have that kind of murky stain, if you will, on Putin's rule.
We should add there are other theories too, beyond the FSB and Chechen militants. Some have pointed the finger at Boris Berezovsky, the oligarch who helped maneuver Putin into the presidency before falling out with him and fleeing to London, where he later funded Alexander Litvinenko's book on the bombings. Berezovsky was well connected in Chechnya, the argument goes, and could have been part of a wider plot. Others think the attackers could have been militants from elsewhere in the region, and it's also possible that not all 4 bombings were carried out by the same people. This is a story that's never been short of theories, but a definitive answer feels just out of reach. But what if, one day, new conclusive evidence came to light that upturned the official narrative? If someone were to find proof that the FSB, indeed Putin, was involved, Do you think it would change much, given where we are now?
The trouble is now you could have video evidence, you could have confessions, you could go back in time and show the world. But we live in an age now where that wouldn't be enough. Russia is in a space now where it wouldn't be enough to change anything.
And actually, in some ways, that, for me, is perhaps the more profound conclusion, that nothing would change.
Not a thing.
We may never know exactly what happened back in 1999. The evidence simply isn't there, or no longer exists, to prove the case conclusively, one way or the other. So instead, we're left with a different question. Having spent months digging into this story, it's clear some things were missed, or at least not given the attention they deserved. Like Ryazan. Why didn't more Western journalists ask questions about what happened there sooner? And Volgodonsk, the Speaker of the Russian Parliament naming the city where a bomb would go off 3 days before it was bombed. Of course, we now have the benefit of hindsight. But for the journalists who first covered this story, looking back at it now, a quarter of a century later, do they have regrets? Do they wish they'd asked different questions before the story and the man at its centre slipped beyond reach? Here's Yevgeny Kiselyov again.
When we were trying to convince our Western colleagues that Putin is leading Russia in the wrong direction, many people looked at us as if we are conspiracy theorists.
Do you think that one of the reasons that more Western reporters didn't look into this at the time, because many Russians did, was that it just felt so unbelievable that the FSB could be behind a campaign to bomb its own people?
I think we were distracted by the war, which started very quickly.
Andrew Harding again.
I think it's quite painful to confront that. There were good reporters who did good reporting. All I can say is I think we should have done. We should have covered it more, and we didn't. You know, it makes you think, and it's a good reminder of how easy it is to fall into patterns in reporting, even when one thinks one's being correct and cautious. There's the sort of consensus thinking, the kind of group think, because I don't think we did anything bad or wrong. I think there were some missed opportunities, yeah.
I think it's a problem of imagination.
David Satter again.
Understanding Russia is very easy, but it requires you to do something that's very hard. You have to believe the unbelievable. But how many people, how many journalists, how many diplomats, how many political leaders are equipped to believe the unbelievable?
Well, look at where I'd come from as someone born in 1965.
Here's BBC journalist Jeremy Vine. He covered that press conference where Boris Berezovsky blamed the FSB and Putin for the bombs. Allegations that most journalists in the room dismissed as too wild to take seriously. He says we have to remember the moment Putin emerged, at a time when it seemed Russia was finally on its way to democracy, to becoming a normal country.
For the whole of my childhood and my teenage years, I was lying in bed in Cheam in Surrey thinking I had Russian nuclear missiles pointed at my head and they could go off at any time. And then along comes Gorbachev and he seems wonderful. And then he's sort of deposed and in comes Yeltsin, who, while constantly drunk, is also benign. And so forgive us, my generation, for thinking we're on a flight path into Russia becoming normal. So it's that brilliant hindsight thing that you're doing on this podcast, which is enabling me to see with a rearview mirror what I could not see on the day.
It is perhaps an unfair exercise to shine a spotlight on the reporters we've spoken to for this series, asking them what they missed 25 years ago. These reporters who picked through the rubble, chased leads in the dark, trying to make sense of a country tilting under their feet. They missed things, of course they did. And we'll have missed things too.
A good friend of mine who's a historian told me once, I'm so glad I don't have to do what you do, which is talk about people who are still alive.
Here's Stephen Lee Myers again.
You know, he liked the idea that in history, the events are past and they don't change. And there are records of this that a historian will hopefully someday have, but it won't be soon. And it won't be as long as this government is in control.
Stephen's friend says he prefers history because the events have passed and don't change. But our understanding of past events does change, with perspective, and as new facts emerge. So we should be clear. What you've heard here is only a second draft of history, written with gaps and doubts. In another 25 years, maybe someone else will come along and do it better. Ask the questions we didn't yet know to ask. But whatever the truth about the bombings, there's no doubt that Russia did change profoundly when Vladimir Putin became president. Right now, the country is closing in on itself. Independent newsrooms shut down, reporters in exile, Western news sites blocked, and Facebook, Instagram and X, the platforms that once connected Russians to the outside world, have been banned. And yet, here's a twist we didn't expect. Only a couple of years ago, back in 2024, a concert hall in Moscow was attacked. Rumours swirled, and as Russians turned to the internet, trying to make sense of what happened, again and again, the same two words appeared in their searches. Ryazan, sugar. Which tells you something. This story, even in Russia today, is not just history. It's still very much alive. The History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs, is a BBC Studios production. Written and presented by me, Helena Merriman. The series producer is Sarah Shebier, and the executive editor is Annie Brown. Sound by Eloise Whitmore. Archive research by Samira Chowdhury. The production manager is Joe Kyle. And the production coordinator is Liz Toohey. The commissioners are Dan Clark for BBC Radio 4 and Richard Knight for BBC Studios.